Stop asking God how. Every time you ask how, you confess separation. God is not figuring it out. God already knows the end. Your only error was trying to help him. The most deeply ingrained misunderstanding about God is not that he is distant, but that he must be persuaded. From childhood, religion and self-help alike have trained the mind to believe that results come after effort, after pleading, after understanding the correct steps. We were taught that if we pray hard enough, think positively enough, or discipline ourselves long enough, then God might respond. This belief feels spiritual, but it is actually mechanical. It assumes a universe that reacts, a God who waits, and a man who must prove himself worthy through struggle. And yet, this entire structure collapses the moment we dare to question a single assumption. What if God never responds at all? Neville Goddard shattered this illusion with a statement so radical that it still unsettles the religious and the rational mind alike. Imagination is God in action, not a tool of God, not a gift from God. God himself, functioning as your own wonderful human imagination. This is not poetic language. It is not metaphor. It is an ontological claim about the nature of reality. If imagination is God acting, then every attempt to force reality, to coerce outcomes, or to demand signs becomes unnecessary. You are not here to convince God. You are here to assume. The Bible, when read through Neville's lens, stops being a historical or moral text and becomes a psychological revelation. God calls things that are not seen as though they were. This is not a promise of future fulfillment. It is a description of creative law. God does not wait for evidence. God does not react to circumstances. God assumes the end, and the world reshapes itself accordingly. The tragedy of most spiritual seeking is that it reverses this order. Man tries to see first so that he may believe, tries to understand first so that he may trust, tries to plan first so that he may feel safe. Yet the law moves in the opposite direction. Belief precedes sight. Assumption precedes movement. Occupation of the end precedes every bridge of incidents that follows. This is the central reversal that almost no one wants to accept, because it strips the ego of its most cherished role. Man's task is not to plan the way. It is not to figure out how the desire will come, through whom or by what means. All of that belongs to God. Man's only task is to occupy the end, to live inwardly from the fulfilled state, to consent internally to a reality that does not yet appear. The moment you attempt to help God by reasoning out the process, you confess that you do not trust divine intelligence. You step out of assumption and back into effort. Long before Neville articulated this truth, the mystic poet William Blake declared that God acts and is in existing beings, not outside them. This single insight dismantles the entire architecture of external worship. God is not an overseer observing your actions from a distance. God is the very awareness animating your perceptions, your feelings, your imaginal acts. When you imagine, God imagines. When you assume, God assumes. There is no intermediary, no separation, no delay imposed by divine hesitation. Delay, when it appears, does not belong to God. It belongs to the incompleteness of the inner act. Once this is understood, a profound relief settles into the nervous system. You realize that reality is not chaotic, random, or cruel. It is intelligent. It answers intelligently because it is animated by intelligence itself. The outer world is not improvising. It is executing. It is responding with precision to the state you occupy, not the words you speak, not the rituals you perform, not the effort you exert. When the inner act is complete, the response is not optional. It is compelled. God knows how reality answers, and that is precisely why you were never meant to figure it out. God is not a responder. God is the knower. There is a subtle but decisive shift that must occur if the law of assumption is ever to feel natural rather than strained, and that shift begins with how God is understood. Most people unconsciously relate to God as a responder, a force that waits for input, evaluates effort, and then decides whether or not to comply. This model feels intuitive because it mirrors human interaction, yet it quietly places God inside time, inside reaction, and inside uncertainty. A responder must wait. A responder must observe. A responder must adjust. But the God revealed through the law of assumption does none of these things because God is not responding to reality. God is knowing reality into being. To know, in the biblical and metaphysical sense, is not to gather information. It is to possess certainty before evidence appears. This is why the comparison of a chess grandmaster is so precise. The master does not react emotionally to each move on the board, nor does he improvise from confusion. He already sees the endgame, while the pieces are still being arranged. Every apparent reaction is actually execution. From the perspective of the novice, it looks like response. From the perspective of the knower, it is fulfillment unfolding exactly as seen in advance. When God is understood as the knower rather than the responder, prayer itself is transformed. Asking ceases to be a negotiation and becomes an acknowledgement. There is nothing to persuade, because persuasion only exists where uncertainty exists. God does not wait to be informed of your desire. God does not require repetition to be convinced of its legitimacy. The desire appears because the end already exists in consciousness. The moment you accept this, the frantic quality of spiritual effort dissolves, and something far more powerful takes its place: quiet certainty. Neville Goddard consistently returned to this idea, insisting that God's knowledge is not external foresight, but internal awareness. God knows the outcome because God is the awareness occupying the fulfilled state. This is why Scripture does not describe God as hoping, wishing, or experimenting. It describes God as declaring. Creation begins with assumption, not with trial. Let there be is not a request to the universe. It is the announcement of what is already known to be so. The human mind resists this because it has been trained to equate knowing with control and control with strain. But divine knowing carries no tension. It does not monitor progress or check for signs. It rests. The reason so many manifestations feel delayed is not because God is slow to respond, but because the inner state has not yet stabilized into knowing. Doubt keeps pulling awareness back into reaction, back into observation, back into waiting. And waiting, psychologically, is the admission that the end is not yet accepted as fact. Once this distinction becomes clear, something remarkable happens. Asking begins to feel redundant. Not because desire disappears, but because the desire is recognized as fulfilled in consciousness. You no longer pray to change God's mind. You pray, if the word still applies at all, to align your own awareness with what God already knows. In that alignment, effort becomes unnecessary, urgency fades, and faith ceases to be a discipline. It becomes a natural state, arising from the simple realization that nothing needs to happen for what is already known to be true. At first glance, the question, "How will this happen?" appears innocent, even reasonable. It sounds like curiosity, like intelligence seeking clarity. Yet beneath this question lies a subtle psychological posture that quietly undermines the entire law of assumption. The moment the mind asks how, it positions fulfillment somewhere outside the self, somewhere not yet secured, somewhere dependent on conditions that have not been met. Asking how is not a neutral inquiry. It is a confession that the end is not yet assumed, that the desired state is still viewed as distant, and that God is perceived as something separate that must bridge the gap. This is why the analogy of the heartbeat is so revealing. You do not ask your own heart how it will circulate blood through your body. You do not supervise the process, offer suggestions, or demand reassurance. The intelligence that performs this function is intimate, automatic, and unquestioned. The moment you begin asking how your heart will work, anxiety replaces trust, and interference replaces harmony. In exactly the same way, when you ask God how a desire will come to pass, you are treating divine intelligence as something external, something uncertain, something that requires oversight. The question of how only arises when identity is misplaced. When a person knows who they are, they do not interrogate the process of being. A wealthy individual does not ask how money circulates into their life at every turn. They assume movement as natural. A loved person does not ask how affection will arrive. It is expected. The asking of how reveals that consciousness is still occupying the state of becoming rather than the state of being. It is not the desire that delays fulfillment, but the identity from which the desire is approached. Neville Goddard often emphasized that prayer, in its true sense, is not asking, but assuming. To assume is to accept without reservation, without explanation, and without surveillance. The mind that assumes does not monitor reality for proof, because proof is unnecessary when certainty is present. Asking how keeps attention locked onto the mechanics of manifestation, which belong entirely to God. Assumption releases attention from mechanics and rests it in identity. This is why asking how feels so exhausting. It generates endless mental scenarios, calculations, and emotional fluctuations. One day the mind feels hopeful, the next day doubtful, all based on perceived movement or lack thereof. Yet divine intelligence does not move incrementally in the way the human mind expects. It orchestrates through people, events, and timing that cannot be predicted or logically sequenced. The attempt to understand how is an attempt to compress infinite intelligence into finite reasoning, and that compression always produces strain. When prayer is reframed away from request and toward assumption, something profound shifts internally. The nervous system relaxes, the mind stops pacing, the desire no longer feels like a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accepted. Asking dissolves because separation dissolves. God is no longer perceived as an external power to consult, but as the very awareness in which the fulfilled state is already known. In that recognition, the question of how simply fades, not because it was answered, but because it was never relevant to begin with. There comes a moment in this teaching when imagination must be removed from the realm of fantasy and restored to its rightful position as causation. Most people have been conditioned to see imagination as something secondary, a mental pastime that entertains but does not create, a refuge from reality rather than the source of it. This misunderstanding is not accidental. If imagination were recognized as causative, effort would immediately lose its authority and the entire economy of struggle would collapse. To accept imagination as God's creative act in man is to accept that creation is finished inwardly before it ever begins outwardly. The blueprint analogy reveals this truth with remarkable clarity. Blueprints do not lift beams, pour concrete, or install windows, yet every structure that stands must obey them with absolute precision. No builder argues with the blueprint. No construction crew improves upon it through enthusiasm or labor. The work that appears physical is simply the echo of an invisible design already accepted as final. In the same way, imagination does not manipulate the outer world directly, but the outer world has no choice except to arrange itself according to what imagination has consented to as real. Neville Goddard insisted that imagination is not a human faculty borrowing divine power, but God himself operating as awareness. This distinction matters deeply. If imagination were merely a tool, it would require force, repetition, and effort to function. But if imagination is God in action, then its activity is effortless by nature. Creation does not occur because you strain to imagine vividly or repeatedly. It occurs because you accept the imaginal act as fact. Acceptance, not intensity, is the creative key. This is why effort feels so incompatible with true manifestation. Effort implies that imagination is weak, incomplete, or insufficient on its own. The moment you feel compelled to push, affirm compulsively, or monitor results, you have quietly shifted your faith from imagination to action. You begin to believe that reality responds to what you do, rather than to what you assume. Yet the law operates in the opposite direction. Action follows assumption. Movement follows identity. The outer world organizes itself in obedience to the inner agreement already reached. When imagination is accepted as cause, something subtle but powerful changes in the way desires are held. They no longer feel like goals in the future, but like states being remembered. The imaginal act ceases to be an exercise and becomes a recognition. You are not trying to create something new. You are consenting to what already exists in consciousness. This consent stabilizes the inner state, and stability is what gives imagination its authority. The resistance many feel toward this idea often comes from a fear of passivity, as though releasing effort means abandoning responsibility. Yet the opposite is true. Accepting imagination as God's creative act demands a deeper responsibility, not for action but for state. You become accountable for what you inwardly agree to as true. Every persistent assumption, whether deliberate or unconscious, becomes a decree. And once imagination is recognized as law, there is no room left for blame, chance, or external causation. There is only the quiet, unyielding truth that what is assumed inwardly must, in time, be expressed outwardly. Effort is often mistaken for devotion. It wears the appearance of sincerity, discipline, and responsibility, yet in the context of divine intelligence, effort frequently functions as interference rather than assistance. This is difficult to accept because human culture equates value with exertion. From an early age, we are taught that reward follows struggle and that ease is suspicious. When this conditioning is carried into spiritual practice, effort becomes a substitute for faith, and strain masquerades as commitment. Yet divine intelligence does not require reinforcement. It requires non-resistance. The analogy of grabbing the steering wheel from a self-driving car exposes this misunderstanding with precision. The system already knows the route, calculates variables instantly, and adjusts in ways far beyond human capacity. Interference does not improve its performance. It disrupts it. In the same way, when the human mind insists on managing outcomes, monitoring progress, or forcing alignment, it interrupts a process that is already infinitely more capable than conscious reasoning. The interference feels productive, but it introduces delay by reasserting personal will over divine knowing. Neville Goddard made a clear distinction between will and imagination. Will strains, imagination accepts, will pushes against appearances, attempting to dominate them. Imagination yields into a state where appearances must eventually conform. The moment effort enters, imagination is no longer trusted as sufficient. The individual begins to believe that the outer world responds to pressure rather than to assumption, and this belief alone is enough to slow the unfolding of the desire. Effort also creates a subtle internal conflict. Part of the mind attempts to assume the fulfilled state, while another part remains vigilant, checking reality for confirmation or contradiction. This divided awareness prevents inner completion. Divine intelligence operates through coherence, not contradiction. It moves smoothly when the inner state is unified and stalls when consciousness oscillates between faith and fear. Effort keeps the mind oscillating, always reaching, never resting, never fully occupying the end. Yielding in this context is not passivity or resignation. It is the highest form of alignment. Yielding means allowing the inner act to be enough. It means trusting that once consciousness has accepted a state as real, the mechanisms of expression are already in motion. The ego resists yielding because it fears irrelevance, yet divine intelligence does not exclude the individual. It expresses through them without requiring their strain or supervision. When effort dissolves, something unexpectedly powerful takes its place. There is a sense of inevitability, a calm certainty that does not need reinforcement. The desire no longer feels fragile or conditional. It feels decided, and decisions made at the level of consciousness do not require constant attention. They execute themselves through channels the mind could never anticipate. In this way, effort is revealed not as a virtue, but as a misunderstanding of how intelligence actually moves. Consent is the creative act. There is a point at which creation becomes unavoidable, and that point is not reached through effort, repetition, or intensity, but through consent. Consent is often misunderstood as something passive or secondary, yet in the metaphysical sense, it is the decisive inner act that activates all outer movement. Nothing in creation begins without agreement. Not agreement with circumstances, not agreement with evidence, but agreement within consciousness. Until that agreement is reached, desire remains hypothetical. Once it is reached, desire becomes law. The contract analogy reveals this mechanism with striking accuracy. Signing a contract does not pour the foundation, raise the walls, or complete the interior of a house. Yet from the moment the signature is placed, an entire chain of events is set into motion. Contractors are scheduled, materials are ordered, timelines are established, and outcomes become inevitable. The signature itself appears simple, almost anticlimactic, yet it carries authority because it represents consent. In the same way, the inner yes given through assumption does not build the manifestation, but it authorizes reality to do so. Neville Goddard emphasized that assumption is not pretending, hoping, or visualizing in the ordinary sense. It is inner agreement. To assume a state is to accept it as true without waiting for permission from the senses. This acceptance is not emotional excitement, nor is it forced belief. It is a quiet settling, a psychological signature placed upon a reality that consciousness agrees to inhabit. Once that signature is placed, the bridge of incidence is not optional. It must unfold because the agreement has already been made. What prevents consent is not lack of desire, but the fear of finality. Many hesitate to consent fully because consent feels irreversible. To agree inwardly that something is done feels like closing the door on alternatives, excuses, and safety nets. The mind prefers to keep desires in a state of possibility rather than certainty, because possibility feels flexible, yet possibility creates nothing. Only decision does. Consent collapses possibility into fact, and that collapse is what activates divine intelligence. This is why partial assumption produces partial results, or prolonged delay. When the inner agreement wavers, reality receives mixed instructions. Consciousness cannot command what it has not fully accepted. Divine intelligence does not punish hesitation, it simply reflects it. The outer world waits not because it is slow, but because the inner authorization has not yet stabilized. Completion is not measured by emotion or excitement, but by the absence of inner negotiation. Once consent is complete, something remarkable occurs. The desire no longer feels urgent. The mind stops rehearsing it. Attention naturally shifts elsewhere. This is not forgetfulness, but fulfillment. Just as a signed contract no longer requires daily contemplation, an assumed state no longer demands mental repetition. It exists as an established fact within consciousness. From that point forward, reality's role is execution, not deliberation. And execution, once authorized, proceeds with a precision that no amount of human planning could ever improve. God moves through people, events, and timing. One of the most persistent sources of anxiety in the manifesting mind is the belief that outcomes depend on personal control. When results do not appear immediately, the mind begins searching for points of failure, for missed actions, wrong words, or insufficient effort. This anxiety arises from a false assumption that God works directly, dramatically, and in isolation. In truth, divine intelligence rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, impersonally, and with extraordinary coordination through ordinary channels that appear unrelated until the end is revealed. The orchestra analogy captures this movement with elegance. An orchestra does not consult the audience for instruction, nor does each musician decide independently how the piece should unfold. The conductor alone holds the vision of the completed composition, guiding timing, rhythm, and entry with precision. From the listener's perspective, the music seems to arise naturally, even effortlessly, yet behind that experience is an intelligence coordinating dozens of moving parts into a single coherent expression. In the same way, God orchestrates fulfillment through people, events, and timing without consulting the limited reasoning of the human mind. Neville Goddard repeatedly reminded his students that the bridge of incidents unfolds through natural means. The friend who calls unexpectedly, the opportunity that appears accidental, the delay that later reveals itself as protection, all belong to the same intelligent movement. When the assumed end is accepted inwardly, life rearranges itself outwardly in ways that feel coincidental, only because the orchestration is invisible. Nothing is forced. Nothing is dramatic. Everything is precise. Understanding this removes a tremendous burden from the individual. You are not required to identify the right person, initiate the perfect conversation, or anticipate the correct timing. These responsibilities belong entirely to divine intelligence. When you attempt to manage them, you are not being proactive, you are expressing distrust. Control arises from the belief that without intervention, nothing will happen. Trust arises from the recognition that everything is already happening in service of the assumed end. This also dissolves blame. When manifestation is misunderstood, people often blame themselves for delays or perceived failures, believing they missed a step or committed an error. But when God is recognized as the orchestrator, blame loses relevance. Events unfold according to the inner state, not according to conscious effort. If movement appears slow or indirect, it is not punishment or incompetence. It is alignment adjusting itself to match the assumption with precision rather than haste. As this understanding deepens, anxiety naturally fades. You no longer feel compelled to manage every variable or interpret every sign. Life is allowed to move. People are allowed to play their roles without pressure or expectation. Timing is trusted, not monitored. In this state, the human role becomes astonishingly simple: to remain inwardly faithful to the assumed end while allowing divine intelligence to conduct the symphony of events that makes its expression inevitable. Delay is often interpreted as resistance from the outer world, as though circumstances were slow to cooperate or reality were withholding permission. Yet within the law of assumption, delay has a far more precise meaning. It does not point to external obstruction, but to internal incompletion. The outer world does not initiate movement on its own, it responds to instruction. When movement has not begun, it is not because the command was ignored, but because it was not fully spoken. The analogy of a command half spoken clarifies this with exactness. A command that trails off mid-sentence cannot be executed, not because the system is faulty, but because the instruction lacks finality. In the same way, an assumption that is intermittently accepted, occasionally doubted or emotionally negotiated, never reaches the point of authority. Consciousness must speak clearly. It must declare the end without qualification. Until that declaration is complete, reality waits, not in defiance but in obedience. Neville Goddard explained that the feeling of naturalness is the true sign of completion. When a state feels natural, it no longer draws attention to itself. It no longer feels like a desire being held or a goal being pursued. It feels like a simple fact of being. Delay persists when the desired state still feels exceptional, fragile, or conditional. The moment it settles into normalcy within consciousness, motion begins, often without announcement or spectacle. This is why impatience is such a revealing emotion. Impatience does not arise from time itself, but from inner disagreement. Part of the mind wants the desire fulfilled, while another part remains unconvinced that it is done. This split produces tension, and tension prevents completion. Divine intelligence does not respond to tension. It responds to coherence. Only when the inner state stabilizes into a single unified assumption does the outer world receive a clear signal. Completion cannot be forced, because force itself is evidence of incompletion. The mind cannot argue itself into certainty. Certainty arrives when the imaginal act is accepted without resistance. This acceptance often occurs not through repetition or analysis, but through relaxation. When the mind releases the need to check, measure, or anticipate, the assumption has space to settle. In that settling, the inner act quietly finishes itself. Delay, then, is not a punishment or a test. It is feedback. It reflects the degree to which the end has been inwardly accepted as final. The moment that acceptance is complete, time loses its relevance. Movement begins not because time has passed, but because instruction has been received in full. The outer world, having no choice in the matter, proceeds to execute what consciousness has already decided to be true. There is a state in which the tension between effort and faith resolves itself without argument, and that state is not reached through discipline or force, but through surrender. Neville Goddard called this the state akin to sleep, because it exists just beneath the surface of waking consciousness, where the mind is still aware but no longer defensive. In this state, the constant need to manage, evaluate, and control softens, and imagination becomes receptive rather than demanding. This receptivity is precisely where divine intelligence takes over. The power of Sats lies in what withdraws, not in what is added. The rational mind loosens its grip, the inner critic quiets, and the imaginal act is no longer interrogated for realism or probability. It is simply allowed to be. Like an overnight system running its processes once the worker has stepped away, consciousness no longer interferes with execution. The inner scene does not need to be elaborate or repeated. Its authority comes from the state in which it is accepted, not from its detail or duration. In Sats, the fulfilled state is not imagined as a future outcome, but experienced as a present fact. This experience is subtle, often understated, marked more by calm certainty than emotional intensity. The desire does not feel urgent because it no longer feels absent. The mind is not trying to make something happen. It is resting in what has already been inwardly completed. This rest is not passivity, but trust embodied. It is at this point that the burden quietly shifts. The individual is no longer responsible for outcomes, timing, or means. Those concerns fall away naturally because they no longer feel relevant. Divine intelligence does not require instruction once the end is assumed. It moves through people, events, and circumstances with precision, while the individual remains inwardly still. Sats is not a technique to master, but a doorway into agreement. When resistance sleeps, assumption speaks clearly. And when assumption is clear, God as imagination carries the entire weight of expression without effort, struggle, or delay. Your only responsibility is to be. God and imagination are one, and fulfillment unfolds as consciousness assumes the end. When the inner act is complete, divine intelligence orchestrates all circumstances effortlessly. Fear and striving are unnecessary. Reality answers with perfect precision, and you are never the doer, only the witness of completion.